So you're telling me you had nothing to do with this?
I've already told you everything I know, Detective. Your composure won't help you here.
We have witnesses placing you at the scene.
The fluorescent lights flickered above the precinct's front desk, buzzing like an anxious mosquito in the silence. Mariah Jenkins adjusted the strap of her bag and tried to ignore the officer leaning over the counter, his polished badge glinting like a threat. Name, he barked, not a question but a demand. She lifted her eyes, calm, precise. Mariah Jenkins. ID. The officer, Sergeant Blake Whitmore, snorted and tapped a folder with the tip of his finger. You're being uncooperative, he said, voice tight with condescension. His gaze lingered too long, scanning her features like he'd found a flaw he was entitled to punish. Mariah's hand stayed steady on the desk, but her chest tightened, a storm building inside her. She wanted to speak, to assert, to remind him that civility wasn't optional, but he leaned closer, and the air smelled of stale coffee and power. You ever think about who's really in charge here? Blake hissed, eyes flicking toward the waiting line behind her, where other officers ignored the scene. Mariah's pulse thrummed with quiet defiance. She wanted to bite back, wanted the words to scold, but instead she whispered almost to herself, I know exactly who's in charge. Blake froze, his smirk faltering, sensing a weight he hadn't anticipated. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, almost accusingly. Outside the glass door, a patrol car's siren pierced the morning calm. But inside, the real confrontation was just beginning. And Mariah knew, in the next heartbeat, everything could unravel. The precinct smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, a combination that made Mariah's stomach twist with tension. She gripped her folder tighter, the laminated edge pressing against her palm. Behind the glass doors, fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Name. A voice snapped, cutting through the low hum of printers and distant chatter. Mariah looked up. Sergeant Blake Whitmore leaned on the counter, polished badge gleaming, arms crossed like a barricade. His tone carried the weight of assumption. Mariah Jenkins, she said calmly, keeping her hands visible. ID, he demanded, sliding a clipboard toward her. She handed it over, noting the slight hesitation in his hand as he scanned her license, as if doubting her right to exist in this space. You're uncooperative, Blake said, tapping her folder with a finger sharp as a scalpel. He looked around the room, seeking an audience, savoring the public nature of his judgment. Mariah's chest tightened. She wanted to respond, to lash out, but instead she let her eyes meet his. I know exactly who's in charge, she whispered, almost inaudible, letting the words hang in the charged air. Blake froze, smirk faltering. His eyes darted toward the officers milling nearby. None intervened. A volunteer clerk shuffled awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Excuse me. Blake's voice was lower now, edged with something like unease. Mariah straightened. I'm here to submit a report. My job is to ensure officers uphold their duty, including you. A ripple ran through the room. The air felt heavier, the buzzing lights louder, the scent of coffee sharper. Blake's jaw tightened. You can't. Watch me, she interrupted, the words a quiet thunder. He stepped back, realizing he'd underestimated her. Mariah felt a cold clarity settle in her chest. This was more than a confrontation. This was the first move in a reckoning that he wouldn't see coming. Outside, a patrol car siren pierced the morning calm. Inside, silence fell. And for the first time, Blake sensed that the woman before him was not ordinary, and that his power might not hold. Mariah turned, filing the report, aware of every eye, every judgment, every unspoken assumption. She would not leave this encounter unchanged, and neither would he. Mariah stepped out of the precinct, the morning sunlight hitting her face like a stark spotlight. Her legs moved on autopilot, but her mind replayed the desk confrontation with meticulous clarity. Blake's make, the deliberate tap on her folder, the way his gaze lingered as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, it all lingered like an ache in her chest. She ducked into a nearby cafe, sliding into a corner booth where the scent of roasted beans and warm sugar offered a fragile comfort. A barista, polite but distant, handed her coffee without a word. Mariah's eyes scanned the room. Patrons chatted, half listening, some shooting glances at her, others pretending she didn't exist. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus, a fellow reviewer in internal affairs. Everything okay? She typed back carefully. Desk encounter. Standard procedure, but tense. Blake involved. Marcus replied almost instantly. Be careful. That one's unpredictable. Remember, he's got a history. Mariah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Unpredictable, she murmured, the word tasting bitter. It wasn't the first time she'd seen the pattern. Microaggressions, public intimidation, colleagues looking away. She'd memorized it all, not just the incidents, but the silence around them. A woman at the next table stirred, glancing at Mariah before returning to her laptop. Mariah noticed a subtle shrug, the slight turn of the body, the unspoken, I shouldn't see this acknowledgement. Even in a civilian space, the bystander effect was alive. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor her. Her mind catalogued each detail. The flick of Blake's eyes toward other officers, the way the intake clerk had hesitated, polite but questioning her credibility. Each gesture, each silence, told the story of a system designed to protect power, not accountability. A man at the counter muttered to the barista about a local precinct scandal. Mariah leaned in just slightly, listening. The casual murmurs of distrust, frustration, and whispered outrage reminded her that injustice didn't only live in formal reports. It thrived in ignored corners, in the silent complicity of observers. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus, don't let him see fear. Keep him guessing. Mariah's lips curved in a small, defiant smile. She closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't naive. She knew the stakes. But she also knew the truth she carried. Her work, her scrutiny, her presence, all of it mattered. And for every silent observer, there was one who could act if courage or principle pushed them. She stood, leaving a few bills on the table, and squared her shoulders. The precinct would see her again soon. Blake would see her again soon. And this time, she would not only be prepared, she would be precise. Mariah walked back into the precinct, folder clutched tightly against her chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, more oppressive than before. Every step on the linoleum floor felt deliberate, measured, an unspoken signal to herself that she would not falter. At the intake desk, Officer Ramirez looked up, eyes briefly flicking over her before returning to his paperwork. Morning, Jenkins. Here for? My report, Mariah said, setting the folder down with care. The corners were aligned, the pages crisp. Each line, each timestamp, each note meticulously documented Blake Whitmore's harassment from a previous encounter. Ramirez flipped through the first few pages, eyebrows rising slightly. You sure you want to go through formal channels? His tone was casual, but the question carried weight, a subtle warning. Yes, Mariah said firmly, her voice steady. I'm filing a complaint under internal affairs. The behavior I experienced at the front desk, she paused, letting the gravity settle, was unprofessional and discriminatory. Ramirez's lips pressed together. Understood. It'll take a few days to get processed. Understood, she replied. She didn't flinch at the implied delay, the bureaucratic buffer meant to protect officers like Blake. She'd seen it before. As Ramirez paged through the folder, he glanced at her notes, his expression unreadable. You've got a lot of supporting details here. Witness names, timestamps, emails, even recordings. Mariah nodded. Yes, I make sure my reviews are thorough. Accountability doesn't happen with assumptions. It happens with proof. A slight pause. Ramirez's pen hovered over the intake form. Be careful, Jenkins. Blake, he's a high-ranking sergeant. People notice when complaints are filed against him. Mariah's eyes met his, unwavering. I'm aware of the consequences. My role is to uphold the standards officers are sworn to, not to avoid discomfort. Another officer passed behind them, nodding politely, clearly aware of tension. Mariah felt the weight of every pair of eyes, the silent observers who might support, those who would ignore, and those who would protect Blake. Ramirez signed off. Your complaint will be logged. You'll get confirmation when it's officially reviewed. He hesitated, then added softly, almost like a whisper, keep your head down. Some things aren't what they seem. Mariah exhaled slowly. I won't, but I also won't back down. She left the desk, filing the report digitally, scanning the precinct one last time. Blake's office door was closed, the nameplate glinting. A pang of anticipation shot through her. He would soon discover the existence of her complaint. And when he did, she knew he would realize she wasn't just an ordinary complainant. She reviewed officers. She evaluated them. And his actions were now under her scrutiny. Outside, a patrol car's engine roared to life, the sound a reminder of the world Blake patrolled with impunity. But inside the walls of internal affairs, the scales of accountability were slowly tipping. Mariah tucked a folder under her arm and walked with purpose, her heart steady. The system could be flawed, slow, and biased, but the truth, when documented, could not be ignored forever. Mariah's steps echoed softly down the corridor of her office building, her heels tapping a steady rhythm that somehow anchored her nerves. Outside the precinct, the world didn't pause. Traffic hummed, conversations floated on the sidewalks, and store doors swung open with a faint scent of morning pastries. But everywhere she went, subtle reminders of Blake lingered, as if his presence followed her like a shadow. At her workplace, she greeted her assistant, Carla, with a polite nod. "Morning, Carla." Carla hesitated, glancing at the folder Mariah carried. "Morning, Jenkins." Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Precinct, tough today." Mariah's lips curved in a small, controlled smile. Standard procedure. She left it there, letting the words hang like a shield. Carla nodded, clearly afraid to probe deeper. Later, in a staff meeting, Mariah presented her monthly review of officer conduct. Blake wasn't in the room, but she could feel the invisible weight of his judgment, the knowledge that he might have access to her evaluations. She noticed the subtle glances of colleagues, curious, cautious, hesitant to voice agreement or dissent. "Reports indicate discrepancies in patrol logs," Mariah said, voice steady. She flipped through the digital slides. "Some officers have recurring complaints of bias, harassment, and misconduct. These patterns cannot be ignored." A junior officer cleared his throat. "Are you implying?" "I'm implying," Mariah interrupted, calm but firm, "that accountability applies to everyone. No one is above the policies they are sworn to uphold." The room went silent. Whispers floated just beyond the conversation, comments like "she's bold" or "careful what you say." Mariah noticed a janitor pausing in the hallway, glancing at the presentation, then moving along without a word. Observers everywhere, but few willing to act. During lunch, Mariah stopped at a local deli. As she waited for her sandwich, a man bumped into her shoulder without apology. She looked up. His eyes flicked toward her folder, then away. The silence between them was heavy, an unspoken reminder of the tension she carried like armor. Later, an email notification pinged on her phone. Subject line: "Blake Whitmore has been assigned to review your reports." Her chest tightened. Her calm, deliberate world suddenly felt smaller, charged with potential retaliation. The air seemed to pulse, every sound louder, every gaze sharper. Mariah closed her eyes briefly. "Then I'll be ready," she whispered under her breath, heart pounding. Her hands flexed around the folder. This wasn't just about survival. It was about ensuring justice, even when it came with personal risk. The city around her carried on, indifferent. But Mariah felt the tension of every silent observer, the subtle judgments, the systemic patterns of compliance and avoidance. Everywhere she looked, the stakes were real, and Blake would soon learn that she was neither intimidated nor ordinary. The conference room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, a mix that somehow heightened Mariah's awareness. Officers shuffled papers, exchanged murmured greetings, and tapped at keyboards. Blake Whitmore sat at the far end of the long table, leaning back with an air of arrogance, his smirk barely hidden. Mariah took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. Her tone, her words, the careful timing. Every detail mattered. "Good morning," she said, voice steady, as she set her folder down. The sound of it hitting the table seemed louder than usual, like a drumbeat marking her presence. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Morning, Jenkins. You're early." "I like to be prepared," Mariah replied, sliding her notes closer. "We have reports to review, patterns to analyze. Shall we begin?" The room went quiet. A few officers exchanged glances, sensing the tension between them. Blake leaned forward, eyes narrowing. I hope this isn't one of your complaints. We have work to do, not witch hunts. Mariah's pulse quickened, but her expression remained composed. These aren't complaints, Blake. These are documented patterns of officer behavior. Our responsibility is to address them, not ignore them. He smirked, a predatory glint in his eye. And you're certain your little evaluations have merit? Or is this just another way to make people fear you? I don't aim to inspire fear, she said slowly, letting each word land. I aim to ensure accountability, including for you. The smirk faltered. Blake's jaw tightened as he shifted in his chair. Excuse me. Mariah met his gaze, unwavering. Your name appears multiple times in reports. Multiple complaints. Patterns of bias. I review every officer's conduct, and your actions are not exempt. Murmurs rose around the room. Some officers stared in shock, others avoided eye contact, aware of the power dynamics at play. Blake's composure wavered as the weight of exposure pressed down on him. You're overstepping, he said sharply. I outrank. You outrank what? Mariah interrupted, voice firm, slicing through his authority like a scalpel. Policy? Justice? Accountability? Your rank doesn't grant immunity from scrutiny, and I am authorized to review all officers, including you. The tension in the room was palpable. Blake leaned back, white-knuckling the edge of the table, the first cracks in his confident facade beginning to show. The other officers shifted uneasily, aware they were witnessing a reckoning. Mariah continued, her voice calm but resolute. I am here to ensure standards are upheld. Microaggressions, harassment, abuse of power, these patterns matter, and I have the evidence to support every claim. Blake's smirk was gone. The air felt heavy, the fluorescent lights above buzzing almost accusingly. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words strong enough to reclaim control. A junior officer cleared his throat. Sergeant, perhaps we should review the documentation. Mariah's chest rose and fell, her calmness deliberate, a quiet storm. This confrontation wasn't about victory, it was about exposing truth. Blake's overconfidence was unraveling in real time. She slid her folder toward him. Review it. See for yourself. The evidence doesn't lie. For the first time, Blake seemed uncertain. The room felt suspended in a tense balance, every observer aware of the unspoken consequences. Accountability was no longer abstract. It had a face, a presence, and it was standing right across from him. Mariah straightened her shoulders, heart steady. She had entered this room prepared for intimidation, for dismissal, for fear, but none of it mattered. Blake's reign of unchecked authority was being challenged, and the silence that followed her declaration carried the weight of impending justice. Mariah sat at her kitchen table that evening, laptop open, folder spread, and a fresh cup of tea steaming at her side. The apartment was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and distant city traffic, the only soundtrack. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, steady despite the tension knotting her shoulders. Blake Whitmore had no idea she was building a file comprehensive enough to leave him exposed. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. Update. Mariah typed deliberately, started compiling evidence. Emails, recordings, witness statements. It's meticulous. He won't see it coming. Good. Keep backups. Don't trust anyone outside our circle. One slip, and it's game over. She nodded, though he couldn't see her. I know. Her first task was digital, emails where Blake had subtly dismissed complaints, the ones that hinted at bias, harassment, or intimidation. Each message was breadcrumb, each timestamp a small, undeniable proof. She saved PDFs, labeled screenshots, cross-reference conversations. Every detail mattered. Next were witness statements. Mariah texted colleagues cautiously, asking for brief notes about interactions with Blake. Some declined, citing fear. Others agreed but insisted on anonymity. One young officer, barely out of the academy, sent a trembling message. He looked at me like I didn't belong. I froze. I can't be alone in this. Mariah's chest tightened. She typed a gentle reply. You're not alone. Documentation matters. Every observation helps ensure accountability. Thank you for trusting me. By late evening, she was listening to audio clips she had discreetly recorded with permission during briefings. Blake's tone, his inflections, his microaggressions, all captured in the clarity of evidence. She paused at one clip where he said, "We don't have time for complaint from people who think they're above the badge." The irony wasn't lost on her. A knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the peephole. "Marcus, everything okay?" he asked as she let him in. His eyes swept the scattered files. "Better than okay," Mariah replied. "We're building a case that can't be ignored." He frowned slightly. "Careful. Blake isn't just arrogant. He's vindictive. One hint that you're consolidating evidence, and he could try to interfere." Mariah tilted her head, resolute. "That's why it's methodical. Every document, every recording, every witness statement, everything is traceable, verifiable. He can't manipulate facts once they're in my hands." They worked late into the night, organizing folders, labeling audio, cross-referencing witness accounts. The glow of the laptop screens illuminated their faces, reflecting determination, tension, and an unspoken understanding. This was more than professional duty. It was moral obligation. As Marcus packed up to leave, he gave her a small, encouraging nod. "You're careful, thorough, and fearless. Don't let him shake you." Mariah exhaled, eyes on the files. "Fear is a luxury we can't afford. Evidence is power, and it will speak for itself." Outside, the city slept, unaware of the meticulous reckoning being constructed within one apartment. Inside, Mariah felt the weight of justice gathering like a storm, precise, relentless, inevitable. The conference room smelled of polished wood and tension. Officers filed in, murmuring softly, their chairs scraping against the floor with each hesitant step. Mariah carried her folder like a shield and a weapon, her every movement deliberate. Blake Whitmore was already seated, arms crossed, his usual smug expression failing to mask a subtle unease. Mariah set the folder down, sliding it toward the center of the table. "We're here to review officer conduct," she said, calm but firm. "Specifically, patterns of harassment, bias, and misconduct that require immediate attention." Blake leaned back, attempting casual defiance. "Patterns? You mean opinions. Jenkins, you're making mountains out of molehills." "I'm presenting documented evidence," Mariah said, her eyes scanning the room, landing on officers who had witnessed his behavior. Emails, recordings, and witness statements corroborate each claim. This isn't subjective. A murmur ran through the room. Officers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward. The power dynamics Blake relied on were cracking. Mariah opened her folder, projecting confidence. "Sergeant Whitmore, multiple complaints of intimidation and biased conduct have been logged. Hey, these recordings capture tone and language indicative of harassment." She pressed play on her laptop. The room filled with the unmistakable cadence of Blake's voice, each phrase precise, unflinchingly documented. Blake's jaw tightened. "You don't understand context," he said, but his voice wavered, his usual bravado faltering under the scrutiny of irrefutable evidence. "Context doesn't negate accountability," Mariah replied evenly. She gestured to the emails. "These messages to colleagues and subordinates demonstrate a pattern of dismissal and intimidation. The timeline aligns with multiple complaints, all of which were ignored until now." An officer cleared his throat. "Sergeant, this is serious. The documentation is detailed and consistent." Blake's eyes flicked nervously around the room. He attempted to interject, but Mariah anticipated him. "I have verified each claim. Witness statements have been anonymized for safety, but they corroborate the recordings and communications. The pattern is undeniable." Whispers grew louder. Blake's smirk was gone, replaced with tight-lipped tension. He tried to regain control. "Jenkins, you can't." "I can," Mariah interrupted, her voice calm, precise, and final. "Internal affairs grant me authority to evaluate all officers. Your rank does not exempt you from scrutiny. These reports are now part of your permanent record." The room fell silent. Every officer present felt the weight of the moment. Some stared in disbelief, others in vindicated relief. Blake slumped slightly, Realizing the scope of exposure, the collapse of influence he had long taken for granted, Mariah exhaled, feeling the tension release in measured increments. Our duty is to enforce standards, not protect favoritism. Harassment, abuse of power, and bias have consequences. Accountability is not optional. Blake's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he knew the damage was done. The evidence was precise, undeniable, and already circulating through the appropriate channels. One young officer finally spoke, voice trembling. "Sergeant Whitmore, the documentation, it's conclusive. You're exposed." The room felt suspended, the silence heavy with the inevitability of justice. Mariah closed the folder and looked around. Eyes met hers with a mixture of fear, relief, and admiration. She had faced intimidation and bias, yet here she stood, unwavering, a professional force of accountability. As the meeting adjourned, Blake remained seated, pale and defeated. Mariah gathered her folder, her pulse steady, heart strong. The reckoning had begun, and for once, authority could no longer hide behind rank or fear. Outside the room, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside, truth had found its stage, and Blake Whitmore, once untouchable, was now forced to confront consequences he had long ignored. The precinct was quieter than usual the next morning. Officers moved about with cautious awareness, glancing at Blake Whitmore as he sat at his desk, pale and silent, reviewing the official notices of disciplinary proceedings. The hum of computers and soft chatter seemed subdued, as if the building itself had absorbed the weight of accountability. Mariah walked past him, her steps deliberate. Blake's eyes flicked up, but he quickly looked away, jaw tight, the air between them charged but unspoken. She didn't need to acknowledge him. The moment had passed into consequence. Her assistant, Carla, approached cautiously. "Mariah, everyone's talking about yesterday. I didn't think he'd actually face consequences." Mariah interrupted gently, offering a small, calm smile. "Neither did I, until the evidence spoke for itself." Carla nodded slowly. "It was incredible. You stayed so composed. I don't know if I could have done that." "Composure isn't about fear," Mariah said, adjusting her jacket. "It's about clarity, keeping track of facts, ensuring accountability, and not letting personal intimidation derail the truth. That's what matters." Later, she met Marcus at a small cafe across the street. The tension of the past weeks lingered in the lines of his face. "How's it feel?" he asked, sipping his coffee. Mariah stared into her own reflection in the dark surface of the cup. Relief? Mostly. But also exhaustion. It's not just about exposing one officer. It's the system, the patterns, the silence that lets behavior like his thrive. Marcus nodded. "I get that. And you've done more than most, held a high-ranking officer accountable. That's huge." "Not huge enough," she replied quietly. "There are others. Patterns that persist. Silence that protects privilege. Complacency that lets bias grow. This was just one battle in a much larger struggle." A server brought their orders, the hum of conversation around them a reminder of the outside world, busy, unaware, indifferent. Mariah sipped her tea, letting herself exhale. Her body carried the tension of confrontation, the adrenaline of exposure, the residual weight of being observed, tested, and judged. Yet beneath it all, there was resilience. Strength, the knowledge that her work mattered, that evidence mattered, that justice, even if delayed, was possible. Marcus leaned back, eyes on her. "You've changed how this precinct sees accountability. People will notice. More than that, they'll follow your example." Mariah nodded. "I hope so. But it won't be easy. Change rarely is. And there's always a cost, personally, emotionally. I've learned that firsthand." She walked back toward the precinct, the winter sunlight reflecting off the windows, casting long shadows. Blake's office was behind her, the door closed, the man inside forced to confront his failures. The world hadn't shifted entirely, bias still lingered, silence still existed, but cracks had appeared, and those cracks could grow. For Mariah, the day wasn't about victory, it was about persistence, about accountability, about resilience. And as she entered the precinct, folder in hand, She felt a quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth had its moment, and that she had ensured it would not be ignored. The precinct hummed with its usual rhythm, the low murmur of radios and the clatter of keyboards forming a steady backdrop. Mariah walked through the corridors with purpose, her folder under her arm. She had become both familiar and formidable, a presence that commanded attention not through intimidation, but through quiet authority. Carla approached her, tentative but smiling. "Mariah, the interns have been asking about your methods. They want guidance on documenting, evaluating, staying professional under pressure." Mariah offered a small nod, eyes scanning the room. "It's about consistency, accuracy, and integrity. Fear or intimidation shouldn't dictate your work. Facts and accountability should." Later, she met Marcus in the Internal Affairs office. "How are you holding up?" he asked, glancing at the folders spread across a desk. "I'm adjusting," Mariah replied, tapping the corner of a report. "The exposure was necessary, but it leaves an emotional residue. You see patterns, systemic failures, and the cost of confronting them. It's exhausting." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You handled Blake Whitmore's case flawlessly. Most people would have cracked under the pressure. You didn't just survive, you set a precedent." Mariah allowed herself a small, wry smile. A precedent isn't enough if the system doesn't support it. People will test limits, bend rules, and sometimes retaliate quietly. Resilience isn't just surviving confrontation. It's enduring the slow grind of systemic change. As she reviewed more officer evaluations, her phone buzzed. A junior colleague had submitted a statement documenting subtle harassment in the field. Mariah read it carefully, noting patterns, timestamps, and corroborating details. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she whispered, a quiet affirmation of the small victories hidden in daily diligence. At lunch, a group of officers invited her to sit. Conversation was cautious but curious, a mixture of respect and apprehension. "Your approach, it's different," one officer said. "You don't just report. You teach, you guide, you hold people accountable without tearing them down." Mariah considered the compliment. Accountability isn't punishment. It's clarity, and it's necessary for trust between officers, with the public, and within ourselves. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent and busy. But inside the walls of Internal Affairs, a quiet transformation was taking place. Officers were learning, observing, and adjusting. Resistance to bias, to harassment, to unchecked power was slowly taking root. Mariah closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. The work was never done, but she felt the weight of her own agency. Each documented incident, each carefully reviewed report, each small intervention was a stitch in the fabric of accountability. Marcus peeked in. "You okay?" "More than okay," Mariah said. Her eyes met his, steady and resolute. "I've learned that resilience isn't just surviving the fight. It's shaping the battlefield so that others don't have to fight blind." And as she returned to her reports, the hum of the precinct became a symphony of quiet determination. For Mariah, resilience was no longer just personal. It was institutional, deliberate, and unwavering. The precinct was a different place now. The hum of radios, the shuffling of papers, and the low murmur of officers had a new cadence, cautious, aware, and watchful. Blake Whitmore no longer carried the same presence he once had. Whispers followed him like shadows, and colleague polite nods were tinged with subtle wariness. Mariah walked past his office, folder in hand, her steps quiet but deliberate. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The evidence she had meticulously gathered, the testimony she had protected, and the recordings she had preserved had done more than expose his behavior. They had dismantled his authority. Across the precinct, a junior officer approached her, hesitant but eager. "Mariah, there's more. Complaints have started surfacing outside your reports. Officers who felt intimidated are finally speaking up. Blake, he's losing credibility fast." Mariah nodded slowly, a measured smile forming. Accountability has a ripple effect. When one pattern is exposed, others follow. Change begins with clarity and persistence, not fear. In Blake's office, he stared at the screen of his computer, reading emails that confirmed his worst fears. Complaints, internal review notices, and evaluations he had thought private were now part of an undeniable record. Colleagues who once deferred to him now avoided eye contact, their silence a stark reminder that power built on fear is fragile. Mariah caught a glimpse of him from across the hall. The man who once leaned over desk with smirks and threats now slumped in his chair, stripped of influence. She didn't feel triumph, just a quiet satisfaction of justice executed without vengeance. Later, she met Marcus at a nearby cafe. "So, it's over?" he asked, cautious optimism in his voice. Mariah stirred her coffee slowly. "For Blake, yes. The evidence, the exposure, the formal proceedings, his authority has crumbled. But for the system? No. There will always be others who push boundaries, exploit silence, and test limits." Marcus nodded. "And you'll be there to hold them accountable." "I will," she said firmly. "And I'll carry the emotional cost with awareness. Justice isn't painless. Change isn't effortless. But it's necessary." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the battles waged in the precinct walls. But for Mariah, the world had shifted, subtly yet profoundly. The knowledge that one person's courage, meticulousness, and resilience could expose abuse and enforce accountability was both empowering and humbling. Back at the precinct, she placed a fresh folder on her desk, another officer evaluation, another record to protect and uphold. Her work continued, deliberate and unwavering. She had seen the fragility of unchecked authority, the corrosive effect of silence, and the power of evidence. Blake Whitmore would rebuild parts of his career, no doubt, but the foundation of fear and privilege he relied on was gone. And Mariah knew, as she straightened her chair and opened the folder, that the quiet, patient persistence of truth was far stronger than any smake, any badge, or any rank. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not without cost, but fairly. And in the echo of her footsteps through the precinct, the reverberation of accountability could be felt by everyone who had watched, waited, and survived.